Education was a centrepiece of Kevin Rudd's push for power in 2007, and Julia Gillard was to deliver his education revolution, with ambitious promises that included putting computers in every school and raising standards across the board with a big funding boost. So how have they measured up? And how does the coalition compare with its education agenda? Simon Crean, who replaced Julia Gillard as Minister just 6 weeks ago, and Shadow Minister Christopher Pyne have agreed to debate their schools policies, and I spoke with them earlier this afternoon. Christopher Pyne was in Adelaide, Simon Crean in Sydney. Simon Crean, can we start with you just outlining briefly the key elements of Labor's education policy?
We believe investment in education is one of the most fundamental decisions governments can take. That's why in the first term of the Labor government we doubled the amount of money going into schools. We increased by 2/3 the amount of money going into vocational education and training, and by 1/3 into universities. Why is this investment important? Because it's the enabler of the individual, and because it also adds to economic growth. It therefore is a return not just to the individual, but to the nation. Now, what we want to do, Kerry, is to continue that investment. Because whilst we doubled the amount of funding going into schools in our first term, it took the Liberals 3 terms to double the amount of funding into schools. We believe in investing in education. They would cut funding to education.
But do you have key planks of policy reform that are part of a new agenda on top of what you say you've done so far?
Absolutely. Well, our key objective is to ensure that by 2015 we lift to 90% the numbers of students that qualify for the equivalent of Year 12. We want to get by 2015 an increase in the number of people with a vocational qualification, and we want to increase to 40% the number of people who graduate with a university degree. Now, that requires investment in the buildings, in the equipment, in the teacher quality. It also requires investment in transparency, access to information, so that parents can make judgments about make judgments about whether their kids are learning well, and then have corrective mechanisms to plug the gaps. So our agenda is very much about continuing the investment, setting national objectives, the national curriculum, the testing, etc., but devolving responsibility for creative local solutions to local school communities, getting the balance between national objectives and local delivery.
Christopher Pyne, how do you critique Labor's agenda?
Well, Kerry, there's 2 aspects to what Simon said that I'd like to comment on. The first is, when you think about Labor's education record, you need to look at what they've actually done. Before the 2007 election, they made an enormous range of very expensive promises. In computers in schools, a program that was to cost $1 billion ended up costing $2.2 billion. And so far they've delivered 1/3 of what they promised, and none of the 100 megabits per second that they promised into local schools. In the Building the Education Revolution, they promised to spend $16 billion on school halls, and some people say they've wasted up to $8 billion. Some say 4, some say 6. Even the ones the government admits have failed are $1 billion of taxpayers' money. So a lot of money has been wasted. With trades training centres, they promised 2,650. They've delivered 22. With childcare centres, they promised 260. They've delivered 32. So in terms of their record, it's long on rhetoric and it's very short on delivery.
And what is the coalition's education reform agenda?
Well, rather than just talking rhetoric, Kerry, like Simon did, what I'd like to give you is some of the examples of our policies. So we are going to massively expand the education tax rebate because we recognise that education is an enormous cost to families. We're going to increase the rebate to $500 for primary school children and $1,000 for high school children. And most importantly, we're going to expand it far beyond what Labor has paid it for, to things like fees in government and non-government schools, the extra costs for children with special needs like those with dyslexia, but also teaching, for music, for other kinds of tutoring, for uniforms as well as for books. So the education tax rebate will be massively expanded. We're going to immediately address what I regard as the discrimination against young people who with disabilities in schooling, who at the moment, if they are in a government school, attract state government funding, but if they move to a non-government school, lose most of that funding. We will establish an education card of $20,000 per student per year to be paid to our most severely disabled children to begin with, and then expanded over the years into the future. So if we're going to put students at the very centre of education with practical programs, cyberbullying programs that allow principals to act for both on and off-campus bullying. We're going to give principals more autonomy, because all the overseas studies indicate that the more autonomy you give for principals, the better outcomes you get in children doing higher education. We recognise that if you're going to introduce a national curriculum, you actually have to give support and training for the teachers. We're going to try and get teachers doing more teaching and less social engineering. And most importantly, we're going to pay the remaining funds in the so-called building education revolution direct to schools so that they can self-manage like the non-government sector has and keep any savings they make because they achieve value for money.
Simon Crean, how do you critique what Christopher Pyne says is the Coalition's central fundamental education platform?
Well, they haven't got a central platform, Kerry. You've just heard him outline a mismatch of objectives, none of which go to the fundamentals of how we continue the education revolution. Just the education tax rebate for a start, Kerry. They announced this policy 3 weeks ago. They still have not submitted it to costings. We believe this is massively underfunded, and we've challenged them to put it in to be tested, but they won't do it because they're hiding the real cost of this scheme. They've talked when they get in their first 30 days of introducing a mini-budget. You know what mini-budget means? Code for cuts. This will be one of the first casualties. And might I say, on top of the fact that their other policy for education is to cut the trade training centres in schools, where we will have 68 completed by the end of this year. They're going to end the computers in schools, and worst of all, they're going to cut the national broadband network. Now, we saw Mr Abbott last night on your show, Kerry, without a clue about what the national broadband network means. He doesn't get it. He thinks national broadband network is about geeks. I'm telling you, this is about connecting our schools to the best in the world. If we want, and this is what we aspire to, the best education system in the world, we've got to connect to the best in the world.
But very briefly, Mr Crean, what tangible... You keep talking about aspirations and hopes and goals. What tangible evidence can you point to that shows that teacher quality in the classrooms, that quality outcomes in the classrooms have actually advanced in the 2 3/4 years that you've been in office, putting your education revolution into practice?
I think what we're seeing is the take-up now in the trade training centres and the vocational certificates means we will achieve that objective of the year 12 90%. This is something...
But what about now?
We've already started to see the increases in the retention rate, Kerry, because we've been investing in the schools themselves. We're seeing better attendance rates at school. We're seeing improvements now that the testing has been going for 2 years in terms of the literacy and numeracy. We're enabling parents to really get much better information as to how they can structure the sorts of things they need for their schools. But unless they have access to the resources to meet them, then what's the point of having the information?
Christopher Pyne, your response?
Well, Kerry, unfortunately, all we've heard from Simon Crean so far in this debate is negative rhetoric about the Liberal Party and fluffy ideas about goals from the Labor Party. What parents who are watching this program want to know is how will a coalition government or a Labor government, should they be re-elected, improve the educational outcomes of their children? What will we actually do for people? And